So it's time for Tell Me a Story. And we are now reading a series of unfortunate events, The Bad Beginning. And what has happened is the kids are saying that they're sharing a house, and they're at a house because their parents have passed, and they're saying that they're at this house. They hate the house. They end up having to do a lot of repairs. They don't like that. And they got left a message that they should make a meal, and they realize they don't know how to cook. They look for a cookbook to show them how. Can't find a cookbook, and yet 10 people are expected for dinner. So let's see what happens with this.
Who in the world would want to visit Count Olaf?
Maybe someone wants to visit us.
In the time since the Baudelaire parents' death, most of the Baudelaire orphans' friends had fallen by the wayside, an expression which here means they stopped calling, writing, and stopping by to see any of the Baudelaires, making them very lonely. You and I, of course, would never do this to any of our grieving acquaintances, but it is a sad truth in life that when someone has lost a loved one, friends sometimes avoid the person, just when the presence of friends is most needed. Violet, Klaus, and Sunny walked slowly to the front door and peered through the peephole, which was in the shape of an eye. They were delighted to see Justice Strauss peering back at them and opened the door.
Justice Strauss, how lovely to see you.
She was about to add, "Do come in," but then she realized that Justice Strauss would not want to venture into the dim and dirty room.
Please forgive me for not stopping by sooner. I wanted to see how you children were settling in. But I had a very difficult case in the High Court, and it was taking up much of my time.
What sort of case was it?
Having been deprived of reading, Klaus was hungry for new information.
I can't really discuss it because it's official business, but I can tell you it concerns a poisonous plant and illegal use of someone's credit card.
Eeka!
This appeared to mean, how interesting, although of course there's no way that Sunny could understand what was being said.
Yika, indeed.
Justice Strauss reached down to pat the child on the head. Sunny took Justice Strauss's hand and bit it gently.
That means she likes you.
She bites very, very hard if she doesn't like you, or if you want to give her a bath.
I see. Now then, how are you children getting on? Is there anything you desire?
The children looked at one another, thinking of all the things they desired. Another bed, for example. A proper crib for Sunny. Curtains for the window in their room. A closet instead of a cardboard box. But what they desired most of all, of course, was not to be associated with Count Olaf in any way whatsoever. What they desired most was to be with their parents again, in their true home. But that, of course, was impossible. Violet, Klaus, and Sunny all looked down at the floor unhappily as they considered the question. Finally, Klaus spoke.
Could we perhaps borrow a cookbook? Count Olaf has instructed us to make dinner for his theater troupe tonight, and we can't find a cookbook in the house.
Goodness, cooking dinner for an entire theater troupe seems like a lot to ask of children.
Count Olaf gives us a lot of responsibility.
Violet wanted to say, Count Olaf is an evil man, but she was well-mannered, so she did not.
Well, why don't you come next door to my house and find a cookbook that pleases you?
The youngsters agreed and followed Justice Strauss out the door and over to her well-kept house. She led them through an elegant hallway, smelling of flowers, into an enormous room. And when they saw what was inside, they nearly fainted from delight. The room was a library. not a public library, but a private library. That is, a large collection of books belonging to Justice Strauss. There were shelves and shelves of them, on every wall from the floor to the ceiling, and separate shelves and shelves of them in the middle of the room. The only place there weren't books was in one corner, where there were some large, comfortable-looking chairs and a wooden table with lamps hanging over them, perfect for reading. Although it was not as big as their parents' library, it was as cozy, and the Baudelaire children were thrilled.
My word! This is a wonderful library.
Thank you very much. I have been collecting books for years, and I'm very proud of my collection. As long as you keep them in good condition, you are welcome to use any of my books at any time. Now, the cookbooks are over here on the eastern wall. Shall we have a look at them?
Yes. And then, if you don't mind, I should love to look at any of your books concerning mechanical engineering. Inventing things is a great interest of mine.
And I would like to look at books on wolves. Recently, I have been fascinated by the subject of wild animals of North America.
Book!
Which meant, please don't forget to pick out a picture book for me.
It is a pleasure to see young people interested in books. But first, I think we'd better find a good recipe, don't you?
The children agreed, and for 30 minutes or so, they perused several cookbooks that Justice Strauss recommended. To tell you the truth, the three orphans were so excited to be out of Count Olaf's house and in this pleasant library that they were a little distracted and unable to concentrate on cooking. But finally Klaus found a dish that sounded delicious and easy to make.
Listen to this. Puttanesca. It's an Italian sauce for pasta. All we need to do is saute olives, capers, anchovies, garlic, chop parsley and tomatoes together in a pot, and prepare spaghetti to go with it.
That sounds easy.
The Baudelaire orphans looked at one another. Perhaps, with the kind Justice Strauss and her library right next door, the children could prepare pleasant lives for themselves as easily as making puttanesca sauce for Count Olaf. The Baudelaire orphans copied the puttanesca recipe from the cookbook onto a piece of scrap paper, and Justice Strauss was kind enough to escort them to the market to buy the necessary ingredients. Count Olaf had not left them very much money, but the children were able to buy everything they needed. From a street vendor, they purchased olives, after tasting several varieties and choosing their favorites. At a pasta store, they selected interestingly shaped noodles and asked the woman running the store the proper amount for 13 people, the 10 people Count Olaf mentioned, and the 3 of them. Then, at the supermarket, they purchased garlic, which is a sharp-tasting bulbous plant, anchovies, which are a small salty fish, capers, which are flower buds of a small shrub and taste marvelous, and tomatoes, which are actually fruits and not vegetables, as most people believe. They thought it would be proper to serve dessert, and bought several envelopes of pudding mix. Perhaps, the orphans thought, if they made a delicious meal, Count Olaf might be a bit kinder to them. Then Violet and her siblings walked home with Justice Strauss.
Thank you so much for helping us out today, Justice Strauss. I don't know what we would have done without you.
You seem like very intelligent people. I dare say you would have thought of something. But it continues to strike me as odd that Count Olaf has asked you to prepare such an enormous meal. Well, here we are. I must go inside and put my own groceries away. I hope you children will come over soon and borrow books from my library.
Tomorrow? Could we come over tomorrow?
I don't see why not.
I can't tell you how much we appreciate this.
With their kind parents dead, and Count Olaf treating them so abominably, the three children were not used to kindness from adults, and they weren't sure if they were expected to do anything back.
Tomorrow, before we use your library again, Klaus and I would be more than happy to do household chores for you. Sunny isn't really old enough to work, but I'm sure we could find some way she could help you.
Justice Strauss smiled at the three children, but her eyes were sad. She reached out a hand and put it on Violet's hair, and Violet felt more comforted than she had in some time.
That won't be necessary. You are always welcome in my home.
She turned and went into her home, and after a moment of staring after her, the Baudelaire orphans went into theirs. For most of the afternoon, Violet, Klaus, and Sunny cooked the puttanesca sauce according to the recipe. Violet roasted the garlic and washed and chopped the anchovies. Klaus peeled the tomatoes and pitted the olives. Sunny banged on a pot with a wooden spoon, singing a rather repetitive song she had written herself. And all three of the children felt less miserable than they had since their arrival at Count Olaf's. The smell of cooking food is often a calming one, and the kitchen grew cozy as the sauce simmered, a culinary term which means cooked over low heat. The three orphans spoke of pleasant memories of their parents, and about Justice Strauss, who they agreed was a wonderful neighbor, and in whose library they planned to spend a great deal of time. As they talked, they mixed and tasted the chocolate pudding. Just as they were placing the pudding in the refrigerator to cool, Violet, Klaus, and Sunny heard a loud booming sound as the front door was flung open. And I'm sure I don't have to tell you who was home.
Orphans? Where are you, orphans?
In the kitchen, Count Olaf. We're just finishing dinner.
You'd better be. My troop is right behind me, and they are very hungry. Where is the roast beef?
We didn't make roast beef. We made puttanesca sauce.
What? No roast beef?
You didn't tell us you wanted roast beef.
Count Olaf slid toward the children so that he looked even taller than he was. His eyes grew even brighter, and his one eyebrow raised in anger.
In agreeing to adopt you, I have become your father, and as your father, I am not someone to be trifled with. I demand that you serve roast beef to myself and my guests.
We don't have any. We made puttanesca sauce. No!
Count Olaf looked down at Sunny, who had spoken so suddenly. With an inhuman roar, he picked her up in one scraggly hand and raised her high in the air so that she was staring at him in the eye. Needless to say, Sunny was very frightened and began crying immediately, too scared to even try to bite the hand that held her.
Put her down immediately, you beast!
Klaus jumped up, trying to rescue Sunny from the grasp of the Count, but he was holding her too high to reach. Count Olaf looked down at Klaus and smiled a terrible, toothy grin, raising the wailing Sunny up even higher in the air. He seemed about to drop her to the floor when there was a loud blast of laughter in the next room.
Olaf? Where's Olaf?
Count Olaf paused, still holding the wailing Sunny up in the air, as members of his theatre troupe walked into the kitchen.
I've never seen anything like it.
Soon they were crowding the room. An assortment of strange-looking characters of all shapes and sizes. There was a bald man with a very long nose, dressed in a long black robe. There were two women who had bright white powder all over their faces, making them look like ghosts. Behind the women was a man with very long and skinny arms, at the end of which were two hooks instead of hands. There was a person who was extremely fat, and who looked like neither a man nor a woman. And behind this person, standing in the doorway, were an assortment assortment of people the children could not see, but who promised to be just as frightening.
Here you are, Olaf. What in the world are you doing? I'm just disciplining these orphans. I asked them to make dinner, and all they have made is some disgusting sauce.
You can't go easy on children. They must be taught to obey their elders.
Are these those wealthy children you were telling me about?
Yes, they are so awful I can scarcely stand to touch them.
With that, he lowered Sonny, who was still wailing, to the floor. Violet and Klaus breathed a sigh of relief that he had not dropped her from that great height.
I don't blame you.
Count Olaf rubbed his hands together as if he had been holding something revolting instead of an infant.
Well, enough talk. I suppose we will eat their dinner, even though it is all wrong. Everyone, follow me to the dining room and I will pour us some wine.
Wonderful idea.
Perhaps by the time these brats serve us, we will be too drunk to care if it is roast beef or not.
Hurrah!
Some wine, yes.
They marched through the kitchen, following Count Olaf into the dining room. Nobody paid a bit of attention to the children, except for the bald man, who stopped and stared Violet in the eye.
You're a pretty one. If I were you, I would try not to anger Count Olaf, or he might wreck that pretty little face of yours.
Violet shuddered, and the bald man gave a high-pitched giggle and left the room. The Baudelaire children, alone in the kitchen, found themselves breathing heavily, as if they had just run a long distance. Sonny continued to wail, and Klaus found that his eyes were wet with tears as well. Only Violet didn't cry, but merely trembled with fear and revulsion, a word which here means an unpleasant mixture of horror and disgust. For several moments, none of them could speak.
This is terrible. Terrible. Violet, what can we do? I don't know. I'm afraid. Me too.
Let's have some dinner!
The theatre troupe began pounding on the table in strict rhythm, which is an exceedingly rude thing to do.
We'd better serve the puttanesca, or who knows what Count Olaf will do to us.
Violet thought of what the bald man had said about wrecking her face, and nodded. The two of them looked at the pot of bubbling sauce, which had seemed so cozy while they were making it, and now looked like a vat of blood. Then, leaving Sonny behind in the kitchen, they walked into the dining room, Klaus carrying a bowl of the interestingly shaped noodles, and Violet carrying the pot of puttanesca sauce and a large ladle with which to serve it. The theatre troupe was talking and cackling and drinking again and again from their wine cups and paying no attention to the Baudelaire orphans as they circled the table, serving everyone dinner. Violet's right hand ached from holding the heavy ladle. She thought of switching to her left hand, but because she was right-handed, she was afraid she might spill the sauce with her left hand, which could enrage Count Olaf again. She stared miserably at Olaf's plate of food and found herself wishing she had bought poison at the market and put it in the puttanesca sauce. Finally, they were through serving, and Klaus and Violet slipped back into the kitchen. They listened to the wild, rough laughter of Count Olaf and his theatre troupe, and they picked at their own portions of food, too miserable to eat. Before long, Olaf's friends were pounding on the table in strict rhythm again, and the orphans went out to the dining room to clear the table, and then again to serve the chocolate pudding. By now it was obvious that Count Olaf and his associates had drunk a great deal of wine, and they slouched at the table and spoke much less. Finally they roused themselves and trooped back through the kitchen, scarcely glancing at the children on their way out of the house. Count Olaf looked around the room, which was filled with dirty dishes.
Because you haven't cleaned up yet, I suppose you can be excused from attending tonight's performance. But after cleaning up, you are to go straight to your beds.
Klaus had been staring at the floor, trying to hide how upset he was. But at this, he couldn't remain silent.
You mean our bed? You have only provided us with one bed!
Huh? What did he say?
Members of the theatre troupe stopped in their tracks at this outburst and glanced from Klaus to Count Olaf to see what would happen next. Count Olaf raised his one eyebrow, and his eyes shone bright, but he spoke calmly.
If you would like another bed, tomorrow you may go into town and purchase one.
You know perfectly well we haven't any money!
Of course you do. You are the inheritors of an enormous fortune.
That money is not to be used until Violet is of age.
Count Olaf's face grew very red. For a moment he said nothing. Then, in one sudden movement, he reached down and struck Klaus across the face.
Ah! Ah!
Klaus fell to the floor, his face inches from the eye tattooed on Olaf's ankle. His glasses leaped from his face and skittered into a corner. His left cheek, where Olaf had struck him, felt as if it were on fire. The theatre troupe laughed, and a few of them applauded as if Count Olaf had done something very brave instead of something despicable.
Come on, friends. We'll be late for our own performance.
If I know you, Olaf, you'll figure out a way to get at that Baudelaire money.
We'll see.
Count Olaf's eyes were shining bright, as if he already had an idea. There was another boom as the front door shut behind Count Olaf and his friends, and the Baudelaire children were alone in the kitchen. Violet knelt at Klaus's side, giving him a hug to try to make him feel better. Sonny crawled over to his glasses, picked them up and brought them to him. Klaus began to sob, not so much from the pain, but from rage at the terrible situation they were in. Violet and Sonny cried with him, and they continued weeping as they washed the dishes, and as they blew out the candles in the dining room, and as they changed out of their clothes and lay down to go to sleep. Klaus in the bed, Violet on the floor, Sonny on her little cushion of curtains. The moonlight shone through the window, and if anyone had looked into the Baudelaire orphan's bedroom, they would have seen 3 children crying quietly all night long. Unless you have been very, very lucky, you have undoubtedly experienced events in your life that have made you cry. So, unless you have been very, very lucky, you know that a good long session of weeping can often make you feel better, even if your circumstances have not changed one bit. So it was with the Baudelaire orphans. Having cried all night, they rose the next morning feeling as if a weight were off their shoulders. The 3 children knew, of course, that they were still in a terrible situation, but they thought they might do something to make it better.
Clearly, we cannot stay here any longer. I would rather take my chances on the streets than live in this terrible place.
But who knows what misfortunes would befall us on the streets? At least here we have a roof over our heads.
I wish our parents' money could be used now, instead of when you come of age. Then we could buy a castle and live in it, with armed guards patrolling the outside to keep out Count Olaf and his troop.
And I could have a large inventing studio.
Violet swung the axe down and split a log neatly in 2.
Filled with gears and pulleys and wires and an elaborate computer system.
And I could have a large library, as comfortable as Justice Strauss's, but more enormous.
Gibbo!
Which appeared to mean, and I could have lots of things to bite.
But in the meantime, we have to do something about our predicament.
Perhaps Justice Strauss could adopt us. She said we were always welcome in her home.
But she meant for a visit or to use her library. She didn't mean to live.
Perhaps if we explained our situation to her, she would agree to adopt us.
But when Violet looked at Klaus, she saw that he knew it was of no use. Adoption is an enormous decision, and not likely to happen impulsively. I'm sure you, in your life, have occasionally wished to be raised by different people than the ones who are raising you, but knew in your heart that the chances of this were very slim.
I think we should go see Mr. Poe. He told us when he dropped us here that we could contact him at the bank if we had any questions.
We don't really have a question. We have a complaint.
He was thinking of Mr. Poe walking toward them at Briny Beach with his terrible message. Even though the fire was of course not Mr. Poe's fault, Klaus was reluctant to see Mr. Poe because he was afraid of getting more bad news.
I can't think of anyone else to contact. Mr. Poe is in charge of our affairs, and I'm sure if he knew how horrid Count Olaf is, he would take us right out of here.
Klaus pictured Mr. Poe arriving in his car and putting the Baudelaire orphans inside to go somewhere else, and felt a stirring of hope. Anywhere would be better than here.
Okay, let's get this firewood all chopped and we'll go to the bank.
Invigorated by their plan, the Baudelaire orphans swung their axes at an amazing speed, and soon enough they were done chopping firewood and ready to go to the bank. They remembered Count Olaf saying he had a map of the city, and they looked thoroughly for it, but they couldn't find any trace of a map, and decided it must be in the tower, where they were forbidden to go. So, without directions of any sort, the Baudelaire children set off for the city's banking district in hopes of finding Mr. Poe. After walking through the meat district, the flower district, and the sculpture district, the three children arrived at the banking district, pausing to take a refreshing sip of water at the fountain of victorious finance. The banking district consisted of several wide streets with large marble buildings on each side of them, all banks. They went first to Trustworthy Bank, and then to Faithful Savings and Loan, and then to Subservient Financial Services, each time inquiring for Mr. Poe. Finally, a receptionist at Subservient said she knew that Mr. Poe worked down the street at Multuary Money Management. The building was square and rather plain-looking, though once inside, the three orphans were intimidated by the hustle and bustle of the people as they raced around the large, echoey room. Finally, they asked a uniformed guard whether they had arrived at the right place to speak to Mr. Poe, and he led them into a large office with many file cabinets and no windows.
Why, hello.
Mr. Poe was sitting at a desk covered in typed papers that looked important and boring. Surrounding a small framed photograph of his wife and his two beastly sons were 3 telephones with flashing lights.
Please come in.
Thank you.
Klaus shook Mr. Poe's hand. The Baudelaire youngsters sat down in 3 large and comfortable chairs.
I'm very busy today, so I don't have too much time to chat. Next time, you should call ahead of time when you plan on being in the neighborhood, and I will put some time aside to take you to lunch.
That would be very pleasant, and we're sorry we didn't contact you before we stopped by, but we find ourselves in an urgent situation.
Count Olaf is a madman. We cannot stay with him.
He struck Klaus across the face. See his bruise?
Excuse me. Poe here. What? Yes. 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 No. Yes. Thank you. I'm sorry, what were we talking about? Oh, yes, Count Olaf. I'm sorry you don't have a good first impression of him.
He has only provided us with 1 bed.
He makes us do a great many difficult chores.
He drinks too much wine?
Excuse me. Poe here. 7. 7. 7. 7. 6.5. 7. You're welcome.
He hung up and quickly wrote something down on one of his papers. Then looked at the children.
I'm sorry. What were you saying about Count Olaf? Making you do chores doesn't sound too bad.
He calls us orphans.
He has terrible friends.
He is always asking about our money. Pucko.
Mr. Poe put up his hands to indicate he had heard enough.
Children, you must give yourselves time to adjust to your new home. You've only been there a few days.
We have been there long enough to know Count Olaf is a bad man.
Mr. Poe looked at each of the 3 children. His face was kind, but it didn't look like he really believed what the Baudelaire orphans were saying.
Are you familiar with the Latin term in loco parentis?
Violet and Sunny looked at Klaus. The biggest reader of the 3, he was the most likely to know vocabulary, words, and foreign phrases.
Something about trains?
Maybe Mr. Poe was going to take them by train to another relative. Mr. Poe shook his head.
In loco parentis means acting in the role of parent. It is a legal term, and it applies to Count Olaf. Now that you're in his care, the Count may raise you using any methods he sees fit. I'm sorry if your parents did not make you do any household chores, or if you never saw them drink any wine, or if you like their friends better than Count Olaf's friends. But these are things that you must get used to, as Count Olaf is acting in loco parentis. Understand?
But he struck my brother. Look at his face.
As Violet spoke, Mr. Poe reached into his pocket for his handkerchief and, covering his mouth, coughed many, many times into it. He coughed so loudly that Violet could not be certain he had heard her.
Whatever Count Olaf has done, he has acted in loco parentis, and there's nothing I can do about it.
Mr. Poe glanced down at one of his papers and circled a number.
Your money will be well protected by myself and by the bank, but Count Olaf's parenting techniques are his own business. Now, I hate to usher you out post-haste, but I have very much work to do.
The children just sat there, stunned.
Post-haste means...
Means you'll do nothing to help us.
Violet was shaking with anger and frustration. She stood up and walked out of the room, followed by Klaus, who was carrying Sunny. They stalked out of the bank and stood on the street, not knowing what to do next.
What shall we do next?
Violet stared up at the sky. She wished she could invent something that could take them out of there.
Okay, so what do you think is going to happen next? Doesn't sound like Mr. Pohl is going to do anything to help them with Mr. Olaf. So join us on Wednesday at 1:15 for Tell Me a Story, a series of unfortunate events that